Hey friends, tonight we settle into the strange and chaotic beauty of being a teenager in ancient Rome, a world where adulthood arrived at 13 and fashion was nothing more than cloth wrapped with boldness. Before you get cozy, gently remember to support only if you truly enjoy these quiet journeys into the past. And feel free to share where you are listening from and what time the night has reached you. It's always comforting to know who else is awake with us across the world. Your life as a Roman teenager begins with the one thing Rome mastered effortlessly. Noise. A restless, echoing noise that rises before sunlight even dares to appear. The first greeting of the day might be your neighbor shouting at his mule, and the mule loudly arguing back across ancient cobblestones. You haven't even opened your eyes, yet you already feel the weight of another Roman morning. It will be messy, unpredictable, and mildly disappointing. If you belong to wealth, you wake inside a villa that could make even the gods jealous. Floors of glittering mosaics beneath you. But elegance comes with inconvenience. Open-air homes invite breezes that rattle through the hallways like mischievous spirits. A servant touches your shoulder with gentle resignation and whispers that it is time, hoping you rise before the rooster resumes its shrill complaints. If you were born lower in fortune, your sleeping arrangements are adaptive. A single room packed with siblings. Everyone stacked like a miniature legion. Straw beneath you, and the sudden realization of morning when someone rolls onto your face. A rooster shrieks outside. Someone argues over bread already, and you imagine inventing the concept of a door just to silence the world for a moment. The scent of Rome follows, a bewildering mix of warm bread, olive oil, incense, sweat, smoke, and whatever mysterious liquid your upstairs neighbor dumped out into the night. Privacy is a myth. Peace left the city long ago. When your feet meet the floor, whether smooth tile or hardened dirt, the cold jolts you awake. You shuffle through scattered objects, jugs, tools, baskets, shoes, and an indifferent cat that believes itself to be a minor household god. Then the city raises its voice again. Vendors shouting that their fruit is fresh when it clearly isn't. Bakers bragging as if bread were political glory. Children racing like tiny caffeinated soldiers. Rome lifts you by the tunic and commands you to continue breathing. Breakfast in this world is more symbolic than satisfying. A suggestion to your stomach, a quiet gesture to keep the gods from hearing your hunger. In a wealthy home, you may taste honey-dipped bread, a few olives, dried fruit, a little cheese. Light and refined, but hardly enough to impress a growing body. Slaves present the food with the exasperated knowledge that complaints are inevitable. If fortune is not yours, then breakfast means bread, hot bread. The kind that doubles as a weapon if thrown. You might soften it with watered wine, a Roman trick to make life appear slightly better, though the taste remains questionable. And yes, wine in the morning is normal. Water alone is too untrustworthy. Teenagers sip diluted wine in the name of hydration, while modern parents would panic at such rebellion. Your family gathers around a table that barely qualifies as one. Your father is already full of politics and irritation. Your mother has mapped the entire day in her mind. Chores, worship, market bargaining, and reminders that you must not embarrass anyone today. If you are wealthy, a slave waits nearby holding your sandals until you finish eating. If you are poor, your sandals arrive flying through the air with aim so perfect a soldier would admire it. Then you step outside. The fragrance of bread and quiet disappointment fades as the full aroma of Rome hits you again. Street food hissing on hot pans. Animals wandering freely. Someone yelling about fish while another insists he lies. And a beggar arguing with a pigeon that refuses to move. Breakfast ends. Fuel obtained. The city continues to shout. Rome does not believe in a slow transition to adulthood. 13 is not an age of innocence here. Rome hands you responsibility with the same seriousness as a senator, minus the pay. The toga ceremony marks this shift. One day you are barefoot, carefree, then suddenly wrapped in the toga of adulthood, a heavy and dramatic symbol of respectability, even though your thoughts are still mostly about snacks. Your parents beam with pride as you try desperately not to fall in front of the entire forum and become a legend of laughter. For girls, the change is even more abrupt. The dolls of yesterday are replaced with discussions of marriage. 13 an age where modern teens struggle picking a profile photo, becomes the age of managing a household, kusin wool, and preparing to raise future citizens who will one day argue in public like everyone else. Rome doesn't wait while you discover who you are. It assigns you a role and expects perfection. Your family trade becomes your destiny, and Romans adore responsibility. They shower you with tasks before you even learn how heavy they are. Boys train for politics, philosophy, war, and the complex performance of social manners. Girls learn to run homes, track finances, guide servants, and avoid scandals in a city built from rumors. Everything is evaluated. The way you stand, speak, wear clothing, even the glance of your eyes. Rome is a theater of noise and judgment. Your hobbies are noticed too. Reading is good. Gambling is frowned upon. Admiring gladiators depends entirely on who catches you staring. Rome demands maturity instantly, loudly, and very publicly. Roman boys wear the toga virilis, like a badge of adulthood, but in truth it is a stubborn creature, determined to trip you at every step. It slips off shoulders, tightens around knees, and collects dirt like a magnet for misfortune. Statues look stressed for a reason, but this fabric announces your new identity. Even at 13, you are expected to be a man. Education fills your days. Outdoor schools where philosophers compete with fishmongers for the right to be heard. You copy Greek texts, memorize speeches, and argue constantly. Rome trains debate the way others train muscles. After school you shadow your father at the forum, witnessing politics as performance. Proud speeches, loud merchants' gestures so dramatic they accidentally hit strangers. He whispers that one day this is your future, while you silently hope to walk without tangling your clothes. Meanwhile, discipline shapes your body. Wooden weapon drills, marching practice, learning the courage and strength of a small future soldier. Rest is rare. The path to Roman manhood is long and demanding, but at least the sandals are usually comfortable. For girls, childhood dissolves even faster. One moment you hold a small wool doll. The next moment, adulthood snaps shut like a trap. Your mother gently speaks of husbands and home management while you are still trying to remember how weaving works. Your day starts before the sun. According to Roman mothers, light is optional but duty is not. The street awakens with shouts, barking dogs, and someone dropping a jar again. And your mother reminds you that your life's work is already waiting. You help with spinning, weaving, cooking, cleaning, and the endless cycle of laundry that never seems to rest in the Roman world. Roman clothing is mostly wool, and wool is a stubborn creature. You heat the water, stir it, scrub stains with tired hands, twist tunics dry, and quietly wish for a miraculous device from the future that could do all of this without making your arms feel like lead. If you come from wealth, your day includes supervising those doing the scrubbing instead of doing it yourself, while you also learn the graceful art of hosting dinner parties. These gatherings are less about food and more about silent judgment. Guests evaluate everything: the seasoning, the seating order, the stories told at the table, and yes, even you. Your mother coaches you in the subtle skill of smiling gracefully, while mentally calculating how to stretch supplies through the month. She also shares the most valuable lesson of all: avoiding scandal. In Rome, scandal isn't rare. It's practically a competitive sport. If your family has little money, the work multiplies. You help manage the stall in the market, haul weights heavier than you are, spar verbally with merchants who think they're comedians, and chase after younger siblings before they accidentally burn down half the street. And through all of this, marriage is creeping closer. At 13 or 14, parents begin discussing potential husbands with the seriousness of diplomats negotiating a peace treaty. Wealth is ideal. A respectable family is even better. A breath that smells like fermented fish is a small tragedy, but one you can live with. Love, though love is as distant as a Greek poem, a luxury for the rare few. In a world built by men who claim to know what is best, girls learn from their mothers the actual truths: how to negotiate, quietly manage coins wisely, and run an entire household while making it look as though someone else deserves the credit. Your routine is demanding, ordered, chaotic, and relentless, and you are only 13. Rome does not wait for time or maturity. Rome simply assumes both already exist. School in ancient Rome is no peaceful temple of learning. There are no tidy classrooms or colorful walls encouraging ambition. Education happens out in the open, pressed against the noise of the city. You learn philosophy while a fish vendor argues loudly behind you. You gather at the Ludas, often just a corner near the street, where the teacher sits with the expression of a man who regrets every choice that brought him into the presence of teenagers. Your classmates arrive armed with wax tablets and boundless restlessness. The noise never stops. A dog wanders up and tries to eat your work. A merchant leans too close and shouts about figs, yet your tita demands focus as if the world isn't shouting in your ear. You learn to write, to count, and to juggle both Greek and Latin, because Romans believed academic suffering should come in pairs. Lessons in rhetoric follow. Rome adored the sound of its own voice. If you could argue passionately and wave your arms like a trained orator, success was almost guaranteed. You rehearse speeches with as much solemnity as a senator, while doing your best not to laugh at the argument happening a few steps away. Those with money move on to the Grammaticus, where the focus becomes literature, geometry, and the fine art of insulting someone with impeccable vocabulary. Discipline is enforced by the teacher's stick. A stick so legendary it often has a name, yet even that is less intimidating than the pressure to grow into a citizen who never stumbles over his words or, worse, his toga. In Rome, learning is not a luxury. It is training for survival in a world that watches and judges constantly. By the time you reach your teenage years, the city expects full participation. Rome sees you not as a child becoming an adult, but as a tool already forged. If your family struggles, your chore list would make a modern teen collapse in protest. You haul water from public fountains, chop vegetables, sweep courtyards, feed animals, and battle dust storms created when your brother shakes out bedding from the window. Laundry becomes combat. Fabrics are soaked, stomped, scrubbed, and wrung dry, while every relative shouts commands like battlefield generals. And when you think it's finally over, your mother appears with another pile. Boys are often sent to learn a trade working under blacksmiths who communicate through hammer strikes, or potters who expect perfection while glaring at every nervous movement. Girls train within the home, absorbing every skill needed to command a household. Your mother guides you as though preparing you to lead troops. One day you will manage storerooms and finances, and she refuses to let you ruin the supply of olive oil. Wealthier youths supervise instead of sweat. But watching others work while pretending to understand grain economics is its own exhausting burden. And if you are truly elite, you must endure etiquette lessons. How to greet senators, how to sit, how not to disgrace the family by wearing the wrong sandals. No matter who you are, Rome insists you contribute. Teenagers are not decoration. They are labor. By 14, you are not preparing for adulthood. You are already in it. Yet somehow, amid the endless responsibilities, young Romans still find room for joy. Friendship in Rome is loud, loyal, and full of trouble. You roam the city together, friends from the neighborhood, from school, cousins, and the one boy who once broke a jar and blamed a passing dog. The city becomes your adventure course. You dodged cots, stray animals, and suspicious puddles while merchants shout at you as if that is their personal civic duty. You gather at the forum, buy street snacks, debate which gladiator is most impressive, gossip about teachers, and celebrate minor public embarrassments, like a senator tripping in his toga. Games fill every corner. Ball games, board games, mock battles, where boys try to tackle each other into the dirt. Girls weave, talk, trade secrets, and roll their eyes behind adults' backs. The baths are your ultimate escape. Steaming rooms full of whispered scandals and laughter that echoes through marble halls. You feel like adults while making the same noise children always have. And of course, sneaking out is a tradition. You slip into crowds to watch racers train, listen to performers, or spy on gladiators warming up. Every outing is dramatic, requiring stealth and occasional sprinting. These friendships survive the chaos because you cling tightly to the people who understand your life. And finally, there is fashion. The true nemesis of the Roman teenager. Clothing is not just attire, it is a test. Gravity and wool conspire against you daily. For boys, the toga is a symbol of adulthood and a trap. You step outside wrapped in what feels like an oversized wool serpent, ready to betray you at the slightest wind. Statues show men in perfect folds, but reality is a constant struggle to keep the thing from sliding, twisting, choking, or collecting street grime. Senators manage elegance because servants fix their clothing constantly. You are alone, wrestling fabric in front of strangers, hoping not to become the latest topic of neighborhood gossip. Girls have their own battles with Roman fashion. You wrap yourself in the stola and palla, garments praised in poetry, but far less graceful when you are the one stepping on them. They are long, heavy, and seem magnetically attracted to furniture, doorways, and the occasional wandering goat. Your hair becomes a daily architectural project requiring pins, patience, and the favor of the gods. One stray breeze, and you invent a new hairstyle against your will. Jewelry is not just decoration. It broadcasts your family's status to anyone within sight. Wealthy girls shine with gold and bright glass beads. Poorer families make do with bone or clay trinkets, or whatever relative brought home from the market that hopefully isn't cursed. Sandals are the only option for your feet. Pleasant enough in summer, regrettable in winter, and guaranteed to break at the most inconvenient moment. Usually, when you are trying to walk with dignity or avoid a puddle of highly suspicious origin, Rome itself watches every outfit as if the entire city moonlights as fashion judges. Too simple is questionable. Too grand is also questionable. A wrinkled tunic is disgraceful. If your toga touches the street, your ancestors feel the shame. Clothing in Rome requires confidence, constant adjustment, and a silent hope that the gods are paying attention. Even your wardrobe carries politics and personal grudges. Leaving home feels like stepping into an obstacle course designed for divine amusement. The streets are alive, unpredictable, and eager to test your balance. The moment you step outside, the city wakes your senses. Vendors shout like champions of a very loud competition. Fresh bread, fresh fish, and questionable promises echo through the air. Rome has a smell that defies polite description. Bread and olive oil mixed with sweat. Livestock, wine, smoke, cooked food, and whatever someone dumped out a window seconds earlier. Every turn brings a new aroma and none of them lie. Walking is a full-contact sport. You dodge impatient donkeys, performers demanding attention, stray dogs investigating everything, and children who run like wild creatures fueled entirely by mischief. Uneven stones threaten ankles. Narrow alleys funnel chaos. Half the city is yelling at the other half. Shops overflow with life. Bakers send warm air into the street. Blacksmiths hammer metal until your bones vibrate. Barbers shave clients in plain view as tavern owners promise drinks you will definitely regret tomorrow. Performers line the roads. Musicians pluck strings with pride. Poets recite verses with dramatic confidence. Acrobats leap as though gravity is merely a suggestion, forcing mothers to whisper desperate prayers. Chariots roar along the roads. When wheels approach, you move because Roman drivers believe speed is strength, and pedestrians should know better. Teenagers escape danger with theatrical sprints and then pretend they were not terrified. Soldiers patrol with silent authority. They are reminders that Rome's power is everywhere, watching, waiting, ready to frown at you into perfect obedience. Even so, the chaos is thrilling. The noise, the danger, the life pulsing through every moment. This is your world. Festivals are where Roman teenagers truly feel alive. The city celebrates so often it is surprising anything productive ever happens. Celebrations are noisy, wild, joyful, and satisfyingly light on rules. Saturnalia turns the world upside down. Masters serve slaves, gifts exchange hands, gambling thrives, and teenagers act like joy itself is a sport. Lupercalia arrives with priests running half-clothed through the streets, playfully smacking people with goat hide in the name of fertility while everyone your age laughs too loudly. Floralia fills spring with flowers, dancing, and performances dramatic enough to impress even a stern senator. Girls adore the fashion. Boys adore the girls pretending not to notice them. Crowds move through the streets, eating sweet treats and roasted snacks, while magicians cheat for applause and actors. where masks carved exaggerated enough to haunt a sleepy imagination. The city transforms into a playground, and then there are the spectacles Rome adores. Gladiators practiced in the amphitheater, flexing muscle and determination while teenagers pretend to care only about the tactics. Parents call the games violent or important, depending on their mood, but you insist you are there to study strategy. At the Circus Maximus, chariots race faster than reason advises. Teens pledge loyalty to teams and shout until their voices fray. Victory feels like divine favor. Defeat feels personal. Entertainment is more than pastime. It is freedom from the endless expectations that wait at home. If you imagine bathhouses as quiet retreats, Rome will correct you quickly. The baths are loud, steamy hives of conversation, laughter, gossip, and relief. This is where teenagers truly gather. Streets are dangerous, homes are full of work, but the baths are the neutral territory where everyone is welcome. You pay a small fee, step inside, and are instantly wrapped in heat so thick your spirit sweats. Rooms connect like a ritual path. Change your clothes, warm up, endure the hot chamber where steam blinds you, and then plunge into icy water that steals your breath while your friends cheer at your suffering. All around you, politics, complaints, jokes, and secrets fill the air. Your hair frizzes without permission. Your skin drinks the moisture, whether you wanted it or not. You snack. You gossip. You pretend not to stare at someone interesting. This place is a community disguised as hygiene. It is where life slows, laughter rises, and adulthood waits outside the door. And then there are the expectations waiting back home. In Rome, reputation rules everything. Your comfort does not matter. Your nerves do not matter. Your family name matters. Boys receive speeches about honor that stretch longer than the road to the forum. Estantol, study the law. Speak with confidence. Train your body. Remember that the neighbors are always watching. Mothers nod in agreement, ensuring you fully understand that every step, every expression, every breath in public shapes how the city sees your family. Rome does not wait for maturity. It demands Italiano. If you are a girl, the expectations become even heavier. Your mother takes command of your training with the seriousness of a general preparing a battle-ready officer. You must learn to run a household with seamless efficiency. Budgeting, watching over servants, weaving, cleaning, organizing storerooms, managing guests, maintaining sacred rituals, and ensuring that the family's supply of olive oil will last through the next decade. And then there is marriage. It is not some distant thought for the future. It is already a plan in motion before you even decide whether poetry makes you smile or if chariot racing is more exciting. Your parents negotiate alliances, dowries, and which potential husband carries the fewest troubling rumors. You sit politely, nodding, while your thoughts scream silently behind your eyes. Roman families expect discipline. They expect modesty. They expect success. They expect obedience. They expect you to carry yourself with the calm confidence of a seasoned politician even while you are still brushing sand off your sandals from yesterday's games in the street. Rebellion doesn't flourish here. It's not that Roman teenagers lack the desire to rebel. They feel it burning plenty. But rebellion only leads to long lectures about honor, responsibility, famous ancestors, the displeasure of Jupiter, and how your behavior might cause the crops to fail. Rome doesn't simply raise its youth. It shapes them with pressure and watchful eyes, with duty and reputation always hanging in the air. Yet, even in a place so obsessed with duty and reputation, one force remains deliciously unstoppable. Teenage love. In Rome, love arrives suddenly, dramatically, like a chariot taking a corner too fast. It is messy and thrilling and risky, impossible to avoid. Much like the city itself, a glance across the forum is all it takes. Someone adjusts their toga without tripping, and you decide the gods have spoken. A charming curl of hair that somehow survived the bathhouse steam, and your heart leaps into destiny. Details, like having a real conversation, can come much later. Friends, as always, provide terrible encouragement. They urge you to write poetry, to speak bravely, to ask for directions on streets you have known since childhood. Bad advice existed long before the internet. Boys tried to impress their crushes with awkward heroics, exaggerated gestures, and poems that accidentally sound like shopping lists. Girls must operate with more subtlety. They perfect the art of the sideways glance. They barely their smile. The careful stroll past the market stalls while pretending not to notice the very person they are entirely aware of. Love letters exist, but in Rome, they're written on wax tablets filled with fiery declarations that should never be discovered by a parent unless one wishes to endure a lecture that may last longer than some wars. Rome is the global capital of gossip. Confide in a friend in the morning and the whole neighborhood has opinions by sunset. Senators gossip, bakers gossip, even the stray dogs look like they have heard rumors. And yet love survives, even thrives. Because in a world that demands composure and control, Roman teenagers still find ways to feel deeply, to obey wildly, to blush at clumsy flirting, and to imagine lives larger than anything they have been told to expect. Love becomes a form of rebellion wrapped in charm. By the time your late teenage years arrive, Rome has already chosen your future. There is no gentle waiting for you to understand yourself or explore possibilities. Rome believes that all that belongs to philosophers, not to real life. You are expected to step into adulthood confidently, even if you are terrified inside. If you are a boy, adulthood arrives loudly. Your father drags you into the forum, introducing you to powerful men whose approval you must somehow earn. They push advice into your hands like scrolls. Uphold virtue, serve Rome, stand tall, make the right decisions. You nod carefully, still unsure how to keep your toga from trying to strangle you. Your future feels like a crowded table. Law, politics, military life, trade, and beyond that, securing family honor, handling money wisely, and one day providing heirs. A small checklist of enormous responsibilities. If you are a girl, your leap into adulthood is even steeper. You become the heart of a household, commanding resources, rituals, meals, workers, and social appearances with unbroken grace. Marriage becomes a negotiated alliance, a living strategy, a lifelong reminder that your choices reflect upon everyone who raised you. Eyes follow your every movement. Judgments arrive silently and constantly. Competence is expected. Excellence is preferred. But here is what surprises outsiders. Roman youth do adapt. They grow into these immense roles. Their confidence may be shaky at first, but Rome's chaos becomes their training ground. The noise strengthens them. The pressure sharpens them. The expectations mold them into proud citizens of the empire. Ready or not, Rome marches ahead, and they must march with it. Centuries later, medieval Europe invented one of the strangest romantic ideas in history. Courtly love, a system where falling hopelessly for someone you could never have was celebrated as noble and pure. It wasn't meant to be physical or fulfilled. It was a philosophy built on longing. Instead of avoid forbidden love, the medieval elite turned it into an art form. The ideal woman was usually married, admired from a distance, and absolutely impossible to pursue. That was the point. Attainable love lacked glory. Only the impossible could be perfect. Knights wrote endless poetry in honor of women who may not have known they existed. They competed in tournaments with tokens stolen or gifted from their muse, announcing loyalty that was meant to remain The lady, in this romantic fantasy, became an earthly angel, a spiritual guide who inspired courage and manners simply by being admired. She was expected to reject advances gracefully, to encourage virtue through distance, and to appear as flawless as the moon, while real noble women dealt with politics, estates, plagues, and survival. Their poetic doubles lived high upon pedestals, worshipped more like symbols than people, and yet this myth gave women a kind of power. Men battled and performed for their approval. Knights vowed that every honorable act was done for the sake of the lady who waited, unattainable, watching from above. It was love turned into ritual, desire transformed into discipline, devotion sharpened by the certainty that it could never be fulfilled. If a knight behaved poorly, the poets would gently insist it was only because he lacked the guiding hand of a lady. Yet if he behaved with valor, it was surely because a lady had inspired his noble heart. In those days, it seemed medieval women were quietly responsible for the turning of the world. perhaps everything except the weather itself. But this life upon a pedestal had its own quiet shadows. For a noble woman worshipped by a knight who was not her husband walked a very delicate path, a tightrope of social grace where one misstep could mean ruin. If she offered too much encouragement, she risked the dark stain of scandal, yet if she rejected him too harshly, she violated the sacred rules of courtesy, so she had to learn the art of gently declining advances while allowing the emotional melodrama that fueled his poetry to flicker on like a candle in a drafty hall. You might think of it as the medieval equivalent of being shadowed by a persistent admirer. Only this admirer arrives in shimmering chainmail, reciting verses about the arch of a brow. Despite the inherent strangeness of it all, this idealization gave noble women a rare and unexpected kind of social gravity in a world that seldom allowed them direct power. For being placed on a pedestal, even one built of imagination, could tilt the world ever so slightly in their favor. While the lady stood high above, the medieval knight placed himself somewhere far less dignified, usually upon his knees, swearing eternal loyalty to a figure who could end his devotion with a single glance. In the realm of courtly love, the knight's devotion was never casual, but rather a full-time occupation of the heart, filled with rituals and vows, and a level of dramatic suffering that was akin to a great, unfolding play. The journey began with the selection of a lady, ideally one who was married, socially superior, and as unavailable as the stars themselves. For this distance was not a flaw, but the very foundation of the romance. If love were too easily won, it could not be noble, and so a married woman ensured that the knight's desire remained distant, painful, and perfect for the crafting of sad, beautiful poetry. He was never supposed to truly win her, but rather to long for her in a state of dignified, courteous agony, pledging total obedience, in a way that was convenient for poets, though surely awkward for husbands. His vows were a strange tapestry of religious devotion and personal yearning, promising to defend her honor, follow her commands, and improve his own soul, even dying gloriously in her name, though ideally he would avoid death while letting the threat of it add a poetic weight to his words. This devotion wove itself into the fabric of everyday life, where a knight might carry her colors, a ribbon, or a scarf, treating a scrap of fabric she may never have actually given him as a sacred relic. Or he might ride into the chaos of a tournament and declare that his victory belonged entirely to her. If he fell, he blamed only his own unworthiness. And indeed, many medieval emotional crises involved knights apologizing to their ladies after tumbling from their horses. Longing became a lifestyle where a knight in this tradition was expected to exist on the brink of emotional collapse, sighing into the wind, composing verses and gazing pensively at the horizon, as if waiting for permission to speak to the source of his misery. One might wonder if it was truly love or self-inflicted chaos, or perhaps a medieval form of adoration where the lady remained unaware of her own influence. Yet the suffering was essential for pain, proved depth, and restraint proved virtue in the impossible. Forbidden distance between knight and lady was the breath that kept the entire system alive. Courtly love did not simply appear, but arrived with an unwritten constitution, a set of rules determining how a knight could adore a woman without sparking a feud. Rules treated by poets with the seriousness of state treaties. The most famous of these guides came from Andreas, a 12th century cleric who chronicled these romantic wanderings in his treatise De Amore, laying out principles that were less like guidelines and more like rigid commandments. He wrote that love could not truly exist between husband and wife, for the medieval world viewed marriage as too functional to harbor such passion, and if one loved their spouse, they were missing the point of this high romance. The rules emphasized secrecy, a quiet irony given how troubadours made their living singing of these affairs. Yet secrecy preserved the illusion of dignity, demanding a devotion private enough to avoid scandal, but public enough to elevate a reputation. Another rule dictated that love must thrive on difficulty, so that obstacles, distance, and disapproval were not problems to be solved, but vital ingredients to be savored, for without suffering a knight was merely having a pleasant time, and there was no poetry in that. The lady, for her part, was required to show mercy without encouragement, measuring her responses in the smallest of degrees, offering just enough kindness to keep the knight devoted, and enough restraint to protect her name enduring a lifetime of poems, comparing her features to the moon. Above all, this love demanded moral improvement, requiring a knight to use his longing to polish his soul to become more virtuous and brave, for if he did not emerge from this emotional trial a better man, he had failed. It was a romance, yes, but a regulated passion so carefully choreographed that it shaped the European understanding of love for centuries. If courtly love was a fire, the troubadours were the ones carrying the torches, poet-musicians of southern France, who took the raw chaos of noble longing and refined it into art, creating a world where every song spoke of hopeless adoration for a distant figure. A troubadour was part poet and part storyteller, composing elaborate verses about knights who adored untouchable ladies, elevating yearning into an art form where a single sigh or a fleeting glance could fuel an entire ballad. These songs traveled from castle to castle, carried by the singers or by the knights who memorized them, and even by queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine, who championed this culture and helped spread the idea that the highest form of love was a structured, beautiful torment. These poets did not just entertain, but shaped reputations. For a knight could commission a song to celebrate his devotion, and a lady could gain prestige through verses praising her virtue, though a clumsy poem could just as easily spark rumors or feuds. The poetry often drifted into the mythical, painting the knight as a flawless hero and the lady as a goddess, using metaphors as thick as the castle walls, claiming hands were whiter than milk and eyes brighter than swords, while the real women likely just wished for peace to run their households. The power of these performers turned personal heartbreak into a collective cultural obsession, making courtly love a fashionable madness. To truly understand why this took hold, one must look to the reality of medieval marriage, which was rarely a matter of the heart, but rather a business of property, alliances, and land rights. From the moment a noble child was born, their future union was often a negotiated move on a political chessboard, with daughters betrothed before they could truly speak and running households before they were grown, their personal preferences swept aside for the sake of stability. Men, too, faced this reality, told to marry for land rather than affection, so that love within marriage was a lucky accident rather than an expectation. Into this emotional desert walked the idea of courtly love, a system where nobles were allowed to feel deeply, provided it was not for their own spouse. Though actual adultery remained forbidden, this emotional wandering was accepted, allowing a woman to be admired and a knight to replace duty with devotion, turning the messy complications of the human heart into something refined, a pressure valve for an aristocracy bound by duty. It breathed new life into the emotional world, creating a sense of drama and purpose, where there had been only duty for a noble woman whose marriage was a political necessity rather than a fulfillment of the heart, could now enjoy admiration without shattering social rules. Just as a knight trapped in a strategic union could pour his yearning into an idealized figure rather than one chosen for dowry calculations. The contradiction was truly astonishing, for medieval society publicly condemned the sin of adultery while privately glamorizing a romantic system built entirely around the sweet agony of wanting someone forbidden. The truth, however, was simple. Courtly love existed precisely because medieval marriage was almost never a matter of romance. And when a spouse is assigned like a feudal tax, the human heart finds somewhere else to wander, preferably toward someone who inspires better poetry. For a system built on the premise of desiring what one could not touch, courtly love walked on tiptoes, dangerously close to excellence. Adultery so close that armies of clergy and irritated husbands spent centuries debating where the line truly lay. The official rule was that this love must remain pure, untouched, and wonderfully impossible. Yet the unofficial reality suggests that many medieval couples treated these rules merely as creative suggestions. The entire structure rested on a fascinating skill of the era, the art of pretending, where a knight could swear lifelong devotion to another man as wife, provided he did so in polished verse rather than in the shadows of a corridor, and a lady could accept his admiration so long as her tone conveyed gratitude for his devotion rather than an invitation to a secret meeting. In theory, it was a grand emotional theater without physical consequence, but humans remained humans even in the 12th century. And a knight who had written 14 sonnets about a woman's hair was not always satisfied with mere metaphor. The troubadours with their silver tongues did not help matters, for their songs blurred the lines, hinting at secret rendezvous and occasionally veering into territories that set the courts buzzing with whispers of which knight had grown too bold and which husband was merely pretending not to notice. The fact that so many romances ended with a vow never to consummate the love tells us quite a lot about how often the opposite occurred, a reality the church predictably despised. Clerics warned that loving someone only in the heart was a spiritual threat, a form of adultery performed entirely with sighs, preaching sermons that condemned this lust disguised as nobility while accusing true troubadours of spreading moral decay through their catchy melodies. Meanwhile, nobles attended these very sermons wearing their ladies' ribbon on their sleeves, leaving husbands in the most difficult position of all, forced to act dignified in public because courtly love was fashionable, while privately fuming at the intrusion. Medieval law codes are filled with suspicious references to jealous husbands and sudden duels, suggesting that while being admired by a famous knight elevated a household's prestige, most husbands simply swallowed their pride and hoped the admirer stayed in the phase of poetic suffering. It was a love that balanced on a knife's edge, required to look adulterous without being so, to inspire desire without fulfilling it, and to burn brightly without setting the world on fire. And somehow, against all logic, it largely worked. Yet for something so supposedly pure, it had a spectacular talent for chaos, leading knights to fall, for the wrong women and kings to grow suspicious, occasionally escalating into political crises or open warfare. For this was geopolitics painted in the colors of romance. One need only look to Eleanor of Aquitaine, the patron saint of complicated romance, whose court in Poitiers became a sanctuary where troubadours invented new definitions of love, and ladies debated the ethics of the heart games of flirtation that some say contributed to the tensions that unraveled her marriage to the French king. When a queen uses emotional devotion as leverage, history pays attention, just as it did with Marie de Champagne, who turned courtly love into a moral courtroom where nobles debated theoretical dilemmas, such as whether a lady could love two men at once. These were intellectual exercises, yet they shaped the understanding of loyalty and power, and real battles were sparked by affairs disguised under the elegant banner of devotion. More than one knight died defending a lady's honor, or perhaps merely the rumor of it, and the church, already suspicious, condemned these scandals as heresy, arguing that kneeling before a lady as one knelt before the Virgin Mary was spiritually dangerous. A bishop even warned that courtly love corrupted kingdoms faster than war, though he likely never had a ballad written for him. Despite the conflicts, the excommunications, and the occasional funeral, courtly love endured because it fed the ego and gave bored nobles something to obsess over between crusades, a spark of unpredictable fire in a world of rigid hierarchy. By the time the Middle Ages faded, exhausted by plagues and wars, this poetic hobby from southern France had grown into a phenomenon that reshaped European literature and the very understanding of desire, leaving a legacy that echoes still. It invented the idea of romantic idealization, that love is ennobling and transformative, shifting literature from tales of battles and saints to the interior storms of emotion, the agony of longing, and the thrill of admiration. From the songs of troubadours to the romances of Arthur, the tension between forbidden lovers like Lancelot and Guinevere became a narrative engine that shook the moral foundations of their world. Authors devoured this formula of the noble hero and the unattainable lady, creating the template for the modern blockbuster and the enduring tropes of unrequited love and the belief that true love requires suffering. Yet beyond art, it revealed a profound hunger for emotion in a world dominated by duty, serving as a socially approved rebellion that allowed nobles to feel intensely while pretending to follow the rules, making life more dramatic, more poetic, and ultimately more human. Even now, the whisper of that medieval idea that love must be longed for rather than possessed lingers in the modern heart. But if we turn the page of history to a different era, we find the Victorian Age, where medicine developed an extraordinary talent for turning almost anything a woman did into a medical crisis. Whether she was not eating enough, eating too much, feeling tired, or feeling energetic, it was all viewed through the lens of illness. And if a woman dared to express an opinion, boredom, anger, or desire, doctors opened their notebooks, as if documenting a rare creature in the wild. While the era produced genuine science, it also created an astonishing catalog of fabricated female disorders used for control, the most infamous being hysteria. According to the physicians of the time, nearly anything could trigger this condition: too much thinking, too little thinking, reading novels, or simply existing too long in a room without fresh air. Hysteria became a medical catch-all that explained everything, and therefore nothing. Almost exclusively diagnosed in women, while men remained conveniently immune. It was not just a diagnosis, but a framework that medicalized a woman's personality and frustrations, labeling her hysterical if she was depressed by lack of rights or angry at being treated like furniture. Instead of admitting that a woman's distress might have social causes, like a loveless marriage or a lack of education. The Victorians turned her suffering into a tidy label, treating desire or the need for intimacy as a malfunction, a fever that needed cooling with sedation and isolation. It made men feel logical and society feel justified. While the truth of human emotion was buried under the weight of a diagnosis, treating the natural flame of the spirit as something that needed to be extinguished. In a world obsessed with the rigid structures of moral purity and the quiet expectation of female obedience, the act of diagnosing women became the perfect tool for policing their behavior. For Victorian medicine did not merely treat imagined illnesses, but in many ways, it created them, leaving thousands of women to pay the price for symptoms they never truly possessed. To fully understand the landscape of Victorian medicine, one must realize that it was never simply about science, but rather morality wearing a stethoscope, where doctors were not just diagnosing ailments but enforcing a specific worldview, believing that society itself was held together by delicate threads of purity and rigid gender roles, and if a single woman tugged at those threads, civilization might unravel. Thus, medicine became a weapon, perhaps not always intentionally cruel, yet catastrophically confident in its judgments, as doctors viewed themselves as the guardians of social order who saw women as naturally fragile, emotional, and constitutionally unsuited for the stress of the world. A convenient perspective that allowed women to be blamed for everything while being excluded from positions of influence. If a woman desired education, independence, or control over her own life, doctors insisted these desires were morally dangerous and therefore medically dangerous, inventing diagnoses to match these fears, such as the fashionable concept of degeneracy, which was less a condition and more a deep-seated anxiety that modern life was corrupting morals and that women, as desirous, were the first sign of a collapsing society. A woman who read too much risked moral overexcitement, while one who enjoyed physical exercise risked becoming masculinized. And she who spoke to freely risked mental derangement as everything became a slippery slope into decay where doctors tied morality to biology with astonishing confidence, claiming a woman's entire personality was governed by her reproductive system. If she was sad, anxious, or angry, it was believed her uterus was acting up, misaligned, or even wandering about the body looking for trouble. A theory outdated even by ancient standards, yet one that enjoyed a strange second life in Victorian Britain. The era also harbored extreme anxiety around female sexuality, portraying desire not as natural, but as a dangerous force that could corrupt society and weaken men, leading doctors to write solemn warnings that too much pleasure could cause madness or infertility, recommending sedation and cold baths to protect the world from her impulses. In reality, these diagnoses reflected Victorian fears far more than Victorian but, as medicine became the language through which society expressed its panic about changing gender roles and desire itself, shaping treatments that would soon become even more invasive. If Victorian medicine had a crown jewel, a diagnosis it polished and displayed with pride, it was hysteria, a condition diagnosed with immense frequency, yet supported by little evidence, a vague and elastic label that covered hundreds of symptoms from fainting and weeping to a tendency toward rebellion or a desire for independence. Hysteria was, in essence, everything Victorian society feared about women wrapped into one convenient medical term, and because it meant whatever a doctor decided it meant, the diagnosis skyrocketed, touching the lives of middle-class women, working women, and mothers alike, while men, suffering similar fatigue, were simply told to rest. Part of hysteria's power lay in its false scientific aura, as physicians borrowed heavily from outdated theories, earnestly insisting that the female reproductive system was unstable and capable of causing emotional chaos, if not strictly controlled, though the truth was that hysteria served as a socially acceptable way to dismiss women as suffering and silence their frustrations. If a woman was overwhelmed by domestic life or furious about her lack of rights, she was labeled hysterical, and the treatments prescribed were designed not to heal but to discipline. Sedatives to quiet the mind, isolation to curb agitation, and regimens designed to restore the patient to the ideal of the quiet, compliant woman. Of all the treatments inflicted upon women, none was as infamous as the rest. Cure developed by Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell, a regimen described as revolutionary for nervousness, but which in practice was a form of psychological imprisonment wrapped in medical respectability. The cure prescribed total inactivity, confining patients to bed for weeks or months, forbidding them from reading, writing, or even thinking too deeply, effectively banning anything that might bring joy or mental stimulation, in the belief that the human soul was like a broken teacup needing quiet to mend. In reality, this eroded mental stability as women who were already depressed or anxious were stripped of their autonomy, feeling their identities dissolve day by day as they were force-fed rich diets and subjected to daily massage to prevent muscle decay, trapped in a bizarre routine of eating, lying still, and obeying. Charlotte Perkins Gilman's story, The Yellow Wallpaper, remains a chilling testament to this psychological wreckage, depicting a woman unraveling under the weight of forced isolation. For the cruelty of the rest cure lay in treating a woman as pain, as evidence of her unfitness, and her creativity as a disorder. If medicine had a final threat lurking behind every scolding lecture, it was the asylum. Institutions presented as havens of care that often functioned as moral storage rooms where inconvenient women could be tucked away with medical justification, committed by a husband or father with breathtaking ease. Victorian asylums operated on the chilling principle that if a woman could not perform proper femininity defined by obedience, calmness, and modesty, she was mentally unwell and could be labeled with moral insanity or hysteria for challenging her husband or seeking autonomy. Once inside, where conditions were often bleak and treatments brutal, even simple acts like crying or pacing were recorded as proof of illness rather than reactions to imprisonment. And the most disturbing aspect was how ordinary the justifications were, allowing a woman grieving too intensely or reading too much poetry to be locked away, silencing her voice under the heavy weight of medical authority. A woman who expressed romantic desire or simply refused the duties of marriage could find herself committed, for the asylum system blurred the boundary between medicine and morality until the two became indistinguishable. And while some women genuinely suffered from severe mental illness, Victorian treatments rarely helped them, leaving others who were entirely healthy to be incarcerated due to family conflicts, property disputes, or simply the inconvenient timing of their emotional lives. The asylum became the ultimate silencing mechanism, holding a great irony within its walls, for male patients with similar behaviors were often treated differently, where men who drank, gambled, or expressed desire were indulged as passionate or high-spirited, while women with those same impulses were seen as deep. In the Victorian asylum, science claimed neutrality, but morality held the keys, and behind those locked doors, countless women disappeared into diagnoses that reflected not their minds, but society's deep-seated fears. If the asylum was a cage, then sedation was the lock, a chemical method of quieting women whose emotions or desires made society uncomfortable, as 19th century doctors displayed an astonishing enthusiasm for drugs that dulled consciousness, handing out opium, laudanum, chloral hydrate, bromides, and ether substances that today would require extreme medical caution, with the casual confidence of a man watering his plants. A medical note might read that a patient is troublesome and therefore her laudanum must be increased, for the solution to de-stress was not understanding but absorption into a chemical fog, making sedation the first treatment offered for hysteria, anxiety, grief, sexual desire, or simply the refusal to smile on command. Victorians treated emotions like medical fires, believing that if a woman burned too brightly, she must be extinguished. And so women were routinely lulled into half-conscious states, where they could neither protest nor participate in their own lives. A practice doctors insisted was healing, calming the nerves, and restoring feminine gentleness, while in reality it merely kept women compliant. Laudanum was the era's superstar, a mixture of alcohol and opium sold openly in apothecaries, and consumed by mothers, daughters, and even infants, easing pain while erasing restlessness, frustration, anger, and desire, creating a dependency that looked very similar to the ideal passive Victorian woman. Chloral hydrate, known as the knockout drops, became another favorite prescribed for insomnia and moral agitation, phrase that essentially meant a woman had opinions-inducing deep sleep that could cause confusion and memory loss, yet doctors continued to prescribe it because a silent patient was easier to manage than a suffering one. What made these treatments particularly cruel was that they were framed as acts of compassion, where a physician might tell a woman she must rest because her nerves were overwrought, then administer a dose strong enough to disable her independence, leading family members to believe they were helping while women disappeared slowly into sedation, their personalities dissolving under the weight of drugs. Victorian sedation was not treatment, but erasure. Not of illness, but of inconvenience, revealing the profound truth that silence, not health, was the real prescription. No aspect of this medicine reveals its moral agenda more clearly than the way it treated female desire, for to these doctors a woman's sexuality was not part of her humanity but a threat and a potential gateway to moral collapse, leading them to pathologize desire so that a woman who wanted intimacy was labeled overstimulated and one dissatisfied in marriage was called disordered. Sexual desire became a medical emergency, described with near-apocalyptic language with journals, warning that excessive passion could cause insanity or spinal collapse. A fear so intense that doctors treated it like a contagious disease, frequently diagnosing nymphomania for symptoms as simple as excessive interest in romance or inappropriate affection toward one's husband. Doctors interpreted desire as a breakdown of feminine virtue, prescribing treatments as alarming as the diagnoses, from forced isolation and ice baths to physical restraints, and in the most extreme cases, surgical intervention, all while simultaneously inventing the pelvic massage to relieve hysteria, a contradiction born of a morality that allowed men to produce pleasure only if they claimed not to understand it. This approach exposed a deep cultural terror that if women were allowed autonomy over their body, they might demand autonomy in every part of life, turning the female body into a battlefield between morality and control. For all its obsession with imaginary illnesses, Victorian medicine often failed catastrophically when a woman's suffering was real, routinely dismissing genuine conditions like endometriosis, postpartum depression, anemia, and chronic pain as mere nerves or moral weakness. The irony was brutal, as the same society that diagnosed women for simply having emotions refused to diagnose them when they were genuinely ill, telling a woman with crippling pain she was exaggerating or labeling a new mother experiencing trauma as hysterical rather than extending compassion. Postpartum depression was almost universally misinterpreted as madness, leading to isolation and sedation rather than support, while diseases like endometriosis existed painfully without names, ignored by doctors who lacked the interest to understand them. Even tuberculosis was romanticized, with the pale skin and weakness of the consumptive beauty becoming a fashion trend, praising women for looking sick before blaming them when they died. Medical research itself reflected this bias, conducted primarily on men, meaning women's illnesses were often invisible in the literature, pathologized or dismissed if they did not fit the male model. By the end of the 19th century, Victorian medicine had wrapped itself in the language of science while preserving centuries-old fears, and although the era eventually gave way to modern medicine, its shadow still lingers in the subtle ways society treats women's emotions and pain today. The ghosts of hysteria and moral panic simply changed their vocabulary, leaving a legacy where women's pain is still statistically more likely to be dismissed, and where the echoes of Victorian fear regarding female sexuality and mental health continue to resonate, reminding us that the medicalization of morality has left a mark that time has not yet fully erased. Postpartum depression was only formally recognized in the late 20th century, more than 100 years after. Victorian doctors had dismissed it as insanity, for anxiety, trauma, and neurodivergence in women were long ignored, because history had framed women's emotions as unreliable. The Victorian assumption that female distress is exaggerated still shapes biases in diagnoses and treatment today, just as the legacy of the rest cure appears in subtler ways, like the idea that women should simply withdraw or quiet, dumb when overwhelmed, a lingering shadow in how society treats burnout. The preference for sedating rather than listening persists in stereotypes that brand women as dramatic instead of acknowledging their suffering. Yet there is another legacy, one forged by the women who resisted Charlotte Perkins, Gilman, Elizabeth Packard, and countless unnamed patients who pushed back, wrote books, and forced medicine to confront its failures. Their resistance planted the seeds for reform for modern psychology and for the eventual dismantling of hysteria as a diagnosis, proving that while Victorian medicine tried to silence women, the women it oppressed helped rewrite the story, leaving a legacy not just of harm done but of voices that rose to challenge it. And as we leave that era behind, we turn back to a much older world, where Alexander entered life not quietly, but into a palace already trembling with ambition, the son of Philip II of Macedon, a man who reshaped kingdoms as a blacksmith reshapes iron, forging a fractured Macedonia into a rising military titan. His mother Olympias was no less formidable, intense, and mystical, telling young Alexander with absolute confidence that he descended from Achilles himself, so from the very beginning. He lived in a home where power was the household language, and generals marched through the palace like moving statues of iron and leather. While other children played, Alexander studied the hardened expressions of veterans, asking sharp, unsettling questions that demanded the political lesson behind every myth and the tactical mistake behind every battle story. It was the Iliad that became his obsession, with Achilles serving as his imaginary companion and unreachable standard, a text he kept under his pillow like scripture. By age 10, Alexander demonstrated his iron core when his father struggled to tame a massive black stallion named Busa. Seeing that the horse was merely afraid of its own shadow, the boy turned the beast toward the sun and mounted him as if they were old friends, prompting Philip to say, "My son, you must find a kingdom big enough for your ambitions, for Macedonia is too small for you." That moment confirmed what Alexander already felt, that he was not meant for stillness, but for an empire he was imagining long before he could grow a beard. At 13, his education became extraordinary when Philip summoned Aristotle, the greatest thinker alive, from the cultivated hills of Stagira, to sharpen the heir's mind. Alexander, expecting a warrior teacher, was met by a man in a linen cloak who asked him a question he had never considered. Is it better to conquer the world or understand it? Aristotle built a school at Mysa, a sanctuary of shade and stone, where Alexander and a select circle of companions studied ethics, biology, astronomy, and politics, away from the noise of the court, learning that ruling required thought as well as force. Aristotle guided him through Homer, teaching him to analyze Achilles rather than just worship him, warning that courage is not. And while Alexander absorbed the lessons of leadership and statecraft, his ambition was refining into a theory of greatness where the world became a puzzle he intended to solve. Mysa was no ordinary classroom, but a gathering of boys who would one day command battalions of Festion. The quiet anchor, Ptolemy; the observant historian, Cassander; the calculating watcher, Seleucus; the destined ruler, and Lysimachus, the bold challenger, all sharpening one another like blades in the same fire. Aristotle treated them like young philosophers, teaching under plane trees that a king is only a man who persuades others he is worth following, a lesson Alexander balanced against his father's belief in the strength of armies. Between lessons on logic and governance, the boys wrestled, raced, and competed in everything from reciting poetry to arguing philosophy, with Alexander rarely losing and learning to win loyalty with a magnetic force even in adolescence. He interpreted every lesson through the lens of conquest, wondering how the world Aristotle described could be unified under one leader, making Mysa the seedbed of an empire. Meanwhile, Philip shaped his son's body for a world where kings survived by strength, beginning training before dawn with riding drills and spear practice that tested endurance. For Macedonians fought as hardened frontline troops, not pampered aristocrats. Alexander mastered the sarissa pike and the fluid movements of the sword, enduring Philip's unexpected drills that forced the boys to climb steep terrain and cross icy rivers, teaching them to conquer discomfort and fear. Alexander never protested, driven by an internal fire to outshine every man, including his father, walking when others collapsed and mounting horses that threw him, treating every bruise like a badge of honor on the path to his destiny. Even Philip noticed that his son trained with the quiet intensity of someone preparing for battles that were still decades away. But for Alexander, the physical exertion was merely fuel for an imagination that already galloped across Asia. When he practiced his swordplay, he did not see the familiar faces of Macedonian sparring partners, but rather the legendary Persian immortals. And during the long, rhythmic marches through the hills, he would whisper lines from the Iliad, under his breath, fighting beside Achilles on the dusty plains of Troy until his childhood myths merged seamlessly with his training. Yet, beneath the dreams of conquest lay a foundation of iron discipline, where he learned the rhythm of command, the necessity of formation, and the deep, silent loyalty required between a leader and his troops, ensuring that every bruise and every exhausting mile prepared him not just to be a prince, but a legend. 2. Alexander mythology was not entertainment, but ancestry. a belief whispered by his mother Olympias and reinforced by priests that he carried the blood of Achilles and Heracles in his veins, a conviction he held with the certainty of someone who intended to prove it true. Olympias cultivated this with theatrical devotion, burning incense and telling tales of speed and strength, not as stories, but as reminders of his birthright, while Alexander absorbed Homer not as poetry, but as prophecy, memorizing the Iliad until Achilles became his model of excellence, swift, proud, and unmatched. But the story also taught him that greatness is often shadowed by loneliness and wrath, a lesson balanced by Philip, who emphasized the labor of Heracles, reminding his son that greatness is earned in sweat long before it is recognized in battle. As Alexander grew, these two influences collided within him, the mystical fire of his mother and the practical steel of his father, creating a young man who stood between worlds, part mortal, part mythic, and fully aware that destiny meant nothing without the work to claim it. Aristotle added the final layer, urging him to see heroes as moral figures capable of ruin as well as glory, warning that even Achilles was not always wise, a lesson Alexander heard as he forged the belief that he would have to earn every inch of the world he desired. War was never a distant concept, but the family business. And Philip brought his son into the gritty reality of military councils, where generals argued over maps scratched in wax, and the air smelled of iron and parchment. Alexander observed, quietly absorbing strategy like a sponge before offering bold opinions that secretly impressed his father. And he learned the trade of war not from a distance, but by sweating beside the troops, earning their respect by sharing their hardships. Philip intentionally exposed him to the aftermath of battle, to broken shields and fallen men, teaching him that empires demand sacrifice, and that one decisive strike can alter the fate of thousands. A lesson that transformed Alexander's ambition from a dream of glory into a fascination with how the world could be reached. Yet the palace at Pella taught him lessons the battlefield could not. For the court was a storm of ambition and whispers, where Philip's brilliance was matched by unpredictability, and every noble had an agenda. Olympias warned him to trust no one who smiled too easily, and Alexander learned to read the room with unnerving precision, studying body language as Aristotle had taught him to study biology, noticing who flattered too much and who avoided his gaze. He realized that kingship required both divine confidence and political skill, making the palace his first true battlefield, where survival was the ultimate test. The theory became reality when a rebellion flared while Philip was away, and the king entrusted his teenage son with the stability of the realm, a decision that stunned the court but which Alexander seized with icy determination. Leading the cavalry north in armor that was perhaps still slightly too large, he studied the terrain and planned ambushes with a clarity that shocked his seasoned officers, striking first when the Illyrians attempted to surprise him and driving them into disarray. Veterans later said he moved as if the gods whispered in his ear, but in truth, it was the result of years of preparation fueled by a burning need to prove himself. And when Philip returned to find the rebellion crushed and the troops adoring his son, he realized with a mix of pride and unease that Alexander sought victory as if it belonged to him. B-17 Alexander was no longer just a prince but a force the court had begun to fear and admire. His intellect honed by Aristotle, and his ambition visible to anyone who dared look. The tension with his father grew as nobles whispered conflicting loyalties, some flattering the son, while others warned him to watch his back. Yet Alexander's confidence only deepened as he studied the map of the world, not for its borders but for its starting points. His mind already wandered eastward to Persia, the vast empire that loomed over Greece, studying it like a hunter studies a lion while waiting for his moment. With Philip preparing for the invasion of Persia, the world was opening up, and Alexander felt the universe tightening around him like armor he was born to wear. No longer a boy dreaming in the gardens of Mysa, but a commander in a rising storm, sharpening himself against the edges of the world, ready for the moment history would finally unleash him. If you were to attend a wedding in ancient Babylon, or imperial Rome, or even a small village in medieval England, you would recognize certain things. There would be feasting, there would be families merging, there would be a nervous bride and a stoic groom, but you would also notice something missing: privacy. Today, we view the union of two people as an intensely private act, a world built for two. But for most of human history, marriage was a spectator sport. It was a legal contract, a property exchange, and a dynastic maneuver, all performed under the watchful and sometimes intrusive eye of the community. The concept of intimacy as we know it as secluded, emotional, and physical, private life is a surprisingly modern invention. To understand the history of the couple, we must understand the history of the crowd that surrounded them. Let us begin with the word itself. Honeymoon? It conjures images of tropical beaches and white linens, but its origins are far earthier, rooted in the agricultural cycles of Northern Europe. The word derives from the practice of the newlyweds drinking meta-heavy, fermented honey wine every day for one full moon cycle, roughly 30 days after the wedding. This wasn't done for relaxation. It was medicinal. Honey was believed to increase fertility. The couple was not being sent away to enjoy each other's company. They were being placed on a strict regimen to ensure the production of an heir. The moon in honeymoon didn't refer to a romantic night sky. It referred to the fleeting nature of sweetness. As the 16th century writer Richard Hughlowet cynically observed, the honeymoon was the time when love was still sweet, before the inevitable bitterness of reality set in. In the ancient world, the wedding night was not a retreat, but a legal necessity. In ancient Rome, marriage could be formed in several ways. One was conferiatio, a high status religious ceremony involving the sharing of a spelt cake. Another was usius, essentially common law marriage, where a woman lived with a man for a year. But regardless of the method, the validity of the marriage often hinged on the public acknowledgement of the union. The Roman procession, the deductio, saw the bride led through the streets to the groom's house. It was loud, chaotic, and intentionally bawdy. Guests sang fescennine versus sued crude and sexually explicit songs designed to ward off the evil eye and encourage fertility. The couple wasn't being shielded from the reality of sex. They were being aggressively reminded of its duty. When they finally entered the bedroom, the door was closed, but the house was not empty. Guests remained, drinking and waiting. The consummation was a public concern because the legitimacy of future children depended on it. As we move into the Middle Ages, this lack of privacy became even more codified. In the drafty castles of Europe, the bedding ceremony became a standard fixture of noble weddings. This was not a private moment. It was a ritual. After the wedding feast, which could last for days, the bride and groom were ceremonially processed to the bed. They were undressed by their attendants, bride by her ladies, the groom by his squires. This wasn't merely practical. It was a way of verifying that there were no tricks, no concealed weapons, and no substitutions. In a world without photographs, identification, ensuring the right person was in the bed was a genuine legal precaution. Once in bed, the couple was often blessed by a priest. Imagine the scene. A small, candlelit stone room, filled with the smell of incense, wine, and unwashed bodies. The priest sprinkles holy water on the sheets to banish demons that might cause infertility. The parents stand by the bedside to witness the union of their houses. Friends crowd the doorway, shouting encouragement and jokes. The couple was required to be seen in bed together. Only then would the guests withdraw. And even then, they didn't go far. They returned to the great hall to continue drinking, often listening for sounds from the chamber above to signal that the deed was done. In some traditions, the morning brought the inspection of the sheets, a humiliating but legally vital check for proof of consummation. If the marriage wasn't consummated, it could be Therefore, the act of intimacy was not a matter of pleasure, but of proof. This public intrusion into the bedroom extended even to royalty, perhaps. Especially to royalty. When William of Orange married the future Mary II of England in 1677, her uncle, King Charles II, personally drew the curtains around the bed, shouting bawdy advice to the terrified couple. Louis XIV of France was put to bed with his bride while the entire court watched. For the aristocracy, the body did not belong to the individual. It belonged to the state. The production of a successor was a matter of national security, and the public felt entitled to supervise the machinery of succession. It wasn't until the 18th and 19th centuries that the fog of the crowd began to lift, and the modern idea of privacy began to take shape. This shift was driven by a change in how society viewed love. As the Enlightenment gave way to Romanticism, the idea of companionate marriage took hold. Marriage was no longer just about property. It was about two souls connecting, and souls, unlike dynasties, required silence to communicate. The bedding ceremony began to fade, replaced by a new custom: the bridal tour. This was the ancestor of the modern honeymoon, but with a twist. In the early 19th century, wealthy British couples didn't disappear to a secluded island. They went on a tour to visit relatives who hadn't been able to attend the wedding. It was a series of social calls, a traveling party. Privacy was still scarce. However, the Industrial Revolution brought with it a new commodity: time. As the middle class grew, so did the desire to emulate the aristocracy. But unlike the landed gentry, the middle class valued respectability and modesty above all else. The raucous, ribald traditions of the past, the shouting, the sheet inspections, the public undressing became seen as vulgar, remnants of a barbaric age. The Victorians, with their obsession with propriety, invented the privacy we now take for granted. The going-away outfit became a staple of the bridal trousseau. The couple would leave the wedding reception early, rushing to a train station to escape the prying eyes of their community. The goal was anonymity. For the first time, the wedding night became a source of immense anxiety precisely because it was private. In the past, the bawdy jokes and rituals served as a bridge, a way to acknowledge the physical nature of marriage. The Victorians removed the bridge. Young women, often kept in total ignorance of biology to preserve their innocence, were sent off with a stranger their husband in a science that was deafening. Manuals and advice books from the late 19th century hinted this panic. They speak of nuptial shock and the need for delicacy. The honeymoon became a designated period of adjustment, a buffer zone where the couple could navigate the awkward transition from acquaintances to intimates, without the judgment of society. It is interesting to note the evolution of the destination. In the mid-19th century, places like Niagara Falls or the Swiss Alps became popular. The grandeur of nature, massive waterfalls, towering mountains was thought to be sublime, inspiring, high moral feelings that would elevate the physical union into something spiritual. By the 1920s and 30s, the focus shifted to sun and sand, the Mediterranean or Florida. The goal was no longer moral elevation, but bodily relaxation. The honeymoon had transformed from a dynastic duty to a romantic imperative. Yet, echoes of the old ways remain. We still have the threshold tradition. In ancient Rome, a bride who tripped over the threshold of her new home was considered a catastrophic omen. It suggested she was reluctant to enter her new life, or that the household gods rejected her. To avoid this risk, the groom would lift her up and carry her across. We still do this today, often without knowing we are reenacting a superstitious ritual from a civilization that vanished 2,000 years ago. We also still have the best man. In the volatile days of Germanic tribal history, a groom might need to kidnap his bride from a hostile neighboring village. He would take his strongest, most capable friend as best man to help fight off the bride's family while they made their escape. The best man wasn't there to hold the rings. He was there to hold the line. Even the wedding veil has a history rooted in the economics of the arranged marriage. In cultures where the groom was not permitted to see the bride before the union was legalized, the veil prevented him from rejecting her looks until it was too late to back out of the contract. It was a tool of negotiation, not a symbol of modesty. As we lie in the dark and drift toward sleep, it is worth remembering that the quiet we enjoy is a luxury. The ability to lock a door, to close a curtain, to exist in a space that belongs only to us and our partner, is a recent development in the long, crowded history of human connection. For thousands of years, to be married was to belong to everyone. The parents who arranged it, the priest who blessed it, the village that witnessed it, and the kingdom that relied on it. The bedroom was a stage, and the couple were merely actors playing a part written by tradition. If the history of marriage is a history of public crowds, the history of courtship is a history of obstacles. Today, the path of romance is paved with instant communication. A text message is sent, and a reply arrives in seconds. But for our ancestors, the space between two people was vast, filled with silence, distance, and a labyrinth of social rules so complex that navigating them required the strategic mind of a general. Before a couple could ever reach the privacy of the altar, they had to survive the public performance of falling in love. And in a world where direct speech was often forbidden, they learned to speak through objects. Consider the hand fan. In the overheated ballrooms of 18th century Europe, the fan was, technically, a tool for cooling the face. But in practice, It was a semaphore system, a silent language used to communicate desire without uttering a word that a chaperone might overhear. A fan held in the right hand in front of the face meant, "Follow me." A fan drawn across the cheek meant, "I love you." A fan dropped on the floor meant, "We will be friends." A fan fanned slowly meant, "I am married." A fan fanned quickly meant, "I am engaged." Imagine the tension of a crowded room in Bath or Versailles. The air is thick with the smell of beeswax candles and lavender powder. A young woman sits across the room. She cannot speak to you. She has not been formally introduced, but she catches your eye, and with a flick of her wrist, she twirls the fan in her left hand. We are watched. It was a romance of millimeters. A closed fan, an open fan, a half-open fan. Every gesture was a sentence, and every misinterpretation could lead to social ruin. It was a high-stakes game, played in total silence, a way of carving out a tiny, private conversation in the middle of a public spectacle. But the fan was necessary because of the chaperone. For centuries, the defining feature of courtship was the lack of solitude. In Spain, she was the duenna, a formidable older woman dressed in black, whose sole purpose was to ensure that a young unmarried couple never exchanged a whisper, let alone a touch. In Victorian England, she was the ant knitting in the corner of the parlor. The chaperone was the physical embodiment of society's distrust. She was a human wall. Her presence meant that courtship was rarely a matter of intimate confession. You could not talk about your deepest fears or your secret hopes with a chaperone sitting 3 feet away, counting her stitches. So, courtship became formal. It became a performance. You discussed the weather, the sermon, the quality of the tea. The emotional connection had to be forged in the subtext, in the glances stolen while the chaperone looked down to thread her needle. In the colder, more pragmatic corners of the world, however, the obstacles were different. In 18th century New England and parts of rural Wales, the problem wasn't just morality, it was temperature. Firewood was expensive. Candles were precious. In the dead of winter, keeping a fire burning late into the night for a young couple to sit and talk in the parlor was a waste of resources. The solution was a practice that horrified visitors but made perfect sense to the locals. Bundling. The young man would arrive at the young woman's house in the evening. The fire would be banked down. The parents would go to sleep, and the courting couple would get into the same bed, fully clothed, often wrapped in heavy layers of wool. Sometimes, to satisfy the demands of propriety, a bundling board, a large wooden plank was placed vertically between them, dividing the bed in two. In other cases, the young woman was tied into a bundling sack, a heavy canvas bag that covered her from feet to waist. There they would lie, in the dark, whispering. It was intimacy born of necessity. The darkness allowed for a different kind of conversation, stripped of the visual cues of the ballroom. In the pitch black of a New England winter, with the wind howling outside and a wooden board between them, they got to know each other's minds before they ever really knew each other's faces. It was a courtship of voices in the dark. When they weren't whispering, they were writing. The history of love is physically heavy with paper. For centuries, the primary vehicle of romance was ink. But writing a letter was not the casual act it is today. It was a labor. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, paper was expensive. Postage was often charged by the sheet and paid by the recipient, not the sender. If you wrote a long, rambling love letter, you were essentially sending your beloved a bill. To sabemani, people used cross-writing. They would write across the page horizontally, then turn the paper 90 degrees, and write over their own words vertically. The result was a dense grid of script, a puzzle that the reader had to untangle with patience. The act of writing required preparation. You had to mend your quill with a penknife. You had to mix your ink. You had to have wax and a seal. And then there was the waiting. If a young man in London wrote to a young woman in Edinburgh in 1750, the letter traveled at the speed of a horse. It could take a week to arrive. A reply would take another week. A single conversation. I miss you. I miss you too. It could take half a month. This delay created a unique, emotional rhythm. Courtship was defined by absence. You spent more time imagining the other person than being with them. The letter became a talisman. It was carried in a pocket, slept with under a pillow, read until the paper dissolved at the folds. The handwriting itself, the slope of the letters, the pressure of the ink became a physical proxy for the person who was far away. In a world of slow time, longing was a constant state of being. But eventually, the distance began to close, and the agent of change was, surprisingly, a dance. Until the early 19th century, dancing was a geometry of separation. The minuet, the gavotte, the country dances were danced at arm's length, often with partners standing in lines or circles, touching only fingertips. You admired your partner from afar. You circled them. You bowed. It was courtship as orbiting planets. Then came the waltz. It arrived from the ballrooms of Vienna and struck Europe like a thunderclap. For the first time, a man held a woman in his arms, his hand on her waist, her hand on his shoulder, their bodies turning together in a closed hold. The scandal was immediate and explosive. Lord Byron, a man not known for his high morals, was shocked when he first saw it. Newspapers called it indecent, intoxicating, and a fatal contagion. Parents forbade their daughters from waltzing. Why? Because the waltz destroyed the safety of the gap. It removed the space that the fan, the chaperone, and the letter had carefully maintained. Into waltz, the couple moved as one unit, spinning until the room blurred, creating a private vertigo where the rest of the world disappeared. It was the first time that public courtship allowed for a sustained, physical embrace. It was the beginning of the modern idea of the couple as an island. As the 19th century turned into the 20th, the barriers continued to fall. The bicycle gave young women a way to outrun their chaperones. The telephone allowed voices to travel through walls without anyone listening at the keyhole. The automobile created a mobile living room, a private space that could move away from the watchful eyes of the front porch. Piece by piece, the architecture of longing was dismantled. The bundling boards were burned as firewood. The fans were put into glass cases in museums. The chaperones were dismissed. The wait for the postman became the ring of a telephone. We gained efficiency, certainly. We gained freedom, but perhaps we lost the specific, heavy atmosphere of the wait. The feeling of a sealed letter in a coat pocket, heavy with a week's worth of thought. The electric tension of a fan snapping shut across a crowded room. The quiet of a snow-covered house where two people lie awake, separated by a wooden board, listening to each other breathe. If the history of courtship is defined by the agony of waiting, then no one in history waited with more desperate intensity than the man who was busy conquering the world. When we think of Napoleon Bonaparte, we see the marble statues. We see the hand tucked into the waistcoat, the bicorn hat, the face of stone that stared down the armies of Europe. But there is another version of this man, one found not in military dispatches, but in the frantic ink-stained letters he wrote by candlelight. In the muddy tents of Italy in 1796, he had been married to Josephine de Beauharnais for only a few days. Before he was sent to the front, he was 26, thin, intense, and completely consumed by a woman 6 years his senior, who moved through the salons of Paris with a grace he could never quite mimic. He left for the Italian campaign, a military masterpiece that would make his legend. But while his mind was moving armies across maps, his heart was entirely in Paris. Imagine the scene. It is late at night in a command tent near Verona. Outside, the camp is asleep, save for the sentries and the occasional stamp of a horse in the mud. The air is cold and smells of damp wool and spent gunpowder. Inside, the greatest strategist of his age is sitting at a rickety field table, his uniform unbuttoned, staring at a blank sheet of paper. He is terrifying to his enemies, but he is terrified of the silence from his wife. He writes with a violence that threatens to tear the paper. His handwriting is notoriously impossible to read, a scrawl of jagged lines and flying ink spots, as if his hand cannot keep up with the torrent of his thoughts. I have not spent a day without loving you, he writes. I have not spent a night without clasping you in my arms. These are not the polished, poetic letters of a courtier. They are raw. They are repetitive. They are filled with the anxieties of a man who knows he is absent. He begs her to write. He scolds her for writing too briefly. He analyzes the ink on her letters to see if she was crying or if she was rushing. He is commanding the destiny of nations. yet he falls into despair if the post-rider is delayed by a day. In Paris, Josephine's reality was different. She was not in a cold tent. She was in the center of a society rebuilding itself after the terror. She was fond of Napoleon, certainly, but his intensity exhausted her even from a distance. While he wrote of burning souls and eternal fires, she wrote back with news of the weather, her health, and her dog, Fortune. The tragedy of their correspondence is the tragedy of mismatched frequencies. He was broadcasting an opera, she was sending a weather report, and yet, this paper trail remains one of the most human artifacts of the 19th century. It strips away the gold braid and the imperial propaganda to reveal the universal vulnerability of distance. But the most atmospheric moment of their story is not the passion of the beginning, but the quiet sorrow of the end. Years later, when he was emperor, and the need for a blood heir became a political necessity, the decision was made to divorce. The ceremony took place on a rainy night in December 1809 in the Tuileries Palace. It was a scene of heavy, suffocating silence. The room was lit by chandeliers, the rain drumming against the tall glass windows. The imperial family was gathered, standing like statues in their court finery. Napoleon, the man who had redrawn the map of Europe, could barely speak. He read a prepared statement, his voice breaking, declaring that for the good of France, he must set aside the only woman he had ever truly loved. Josephine tried to read her response, but she dissolved into tears and collapsed. It was the undoing of the great romance, played out in a room filled with velvet and gold, yet entirely empty of joy. They divorced, but they never really separated. He allowed her to keep the title of Empress. He gave her the Chateau of Malmaison, a beautiful estate filled with the roses she loved to cultivate. And he continued to write to her. The tone changed. The fire of the Italian campaign had cooled into a deep, melancholy friendship. He wrote to her about his new wife, about his son, about his defeats. When he was exiled to Elba, and later to the dark rock of St. Helena, the silence finally won. Legend tells us that when Napoleon died, alone in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, the last word he whispered was not France, and it was not army. It was Josephine. It is a reminder that history is not just the movement of borders or the signing of treaties. It is also the accumulation of small, private griefs. It is the stack of letters, tied with ribbon, in a drawer. It is the sound of a pen scratching on paper in a lonely tent. It is the memory of a rose garden in the rain. Across the Atlantic, on the wind-swept coast of Massachusetts, another correspondence was shaping history. But where Napoleon's letters were frantic and jagged, these letters were steady, enduring, and forged in the iron cold of a New England winter. This is the story of John and Abigail Adams. While Napoleon fought for glory, John Adams fought for a nation that did not yet exist. And while he argued in the sweltering heat of Philadelphia during the Continental Congress, Abigail remained at their farm in Braintree, facing the Atlantic wind, the British fleet, and the terrifying silence of a house without its master. Their marriage was unique for its time. It was a partnership of absolute intellectual equality. In an era when women were legally considered the property of their husbands, John and Abigail operated as a republic of two. Imagine the atmosphere of the Adams farm in 1776. The wood fires are burning low to conserve fuel. The children are asleep upstairs. Outside, the snow is drifting against the clapboard walls. Abigail sits at a small wooden desk, dipping her quill into the inkwell. She is tired. She has spent the day managing crops, negotiating with tenants, and melting down pewter spoons to make musket balls for the militia. She begins her letter, not with my lord or dear husband, but with the salutation that would define their lives. My dearest friend. In these letters, we see the architecture of a new world being built. They debated politics, philosophy, and war. But woven between the lines of high treason and revolution were the mundane, anchoring details of intimacy. Abigail would write about the price of linen, the smallpox inoculation of their children, and the loneliness that felt like a physical weight. John, besieged by the egos of the founding fathers, found his only sanctuary in her words. He wrote to her of his exhaustion, his doubts, and his longing for the quiet of their farm. I am sick of the fog and the dust, he wrote. I long for my rocks and my fir trees. There was a danger here, too. If their letters were intercepted by the British, they could be used as evidence of treason. They were writing their own death warrants with every dip of the pen. Yet, they could not stop. The letter was their lifeline. It was the only place where they could be fully themselves. One of the most poignant aspects of their correspondence is the silence that hangs between the dates. A letter might take 3 weeks to travel from Boston to Philadelphia. By the time John read Abigail's account of a battle near their home, the smoke had long since cleared. They were living in a constant state of historical lag, loving each other across a delay of weeks. But unlike the tragic burn of Napoleon and Josephine, the flame between John and Abigail was steady. It was a love built on the sturdy wood of friendship and respect. When they were finally reunited after years of war and diplomatic service in Europe, the letters stopped. The silence of their later years is not a silence of emptiness, but of presence. They no longer needed to write, because they were finally, peacefully, in the same room. The Queen in Black, a timeless love story preserved in amber forever. Tone, deeply melancholic, quiet, reverent. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, and the rugged homespun of the Revolution was replaced by the heavy velvet of the Victorian age, the nature of royal marriage shifted again. We travel now to the misty corridors of Windsor Castle to witness a love story that changed the way the world thought about grief. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. Their beginning was unusual. She was the queen of the most powerful empire on earth. He was a minor German prince. Protocol dictated that no one could propose to the monarch. So, in October 1839, in a small private room, the young Queen Victoria had to ask Albert to marry her. It was a moment of terrifying vulnerability, masked by royal duty. He said yes, and their union became the engine of the 19th century. Unlike the arranged marriages of the past, this was a working partnership. They set up twin desks, side by side, where they would work on state papers for hours. In the quiet companionship of the lamplight, they retreated to Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, a sanctuary designed by Albert himself, where they could escape the prying eyes of the court and play with their children on the beach, away from the heavy gold of the crown. They invented the modern idea of the family Christmas, bringing the German tradition of the decorated fir tree into English homes. They championed technology, science, and art. They were a team. But the Victorian era is not defined by their happiness. It is defined by what happened when it ended. On a dark December night in 1861, in the Blue Room at Windsor Castle, Prince Albert died. He was 42. The silence that fell over the castle was absolute. And for Victoria, time simply stopped. For the next 40 years, the Queen became the widow of the world. She dressed entirely in black. She refused to appear in public, but it is in the private rituals of her grief that we find the most haunting atmosphere. Victoria ordered that nothing in Albert's rooms was to be changed. For 4 decades, the layout of the Blue Room remained exactly as it was the moment he took his last breath. But it wasn't a dusty tomb. It was kept as a living space. Every morning, servants brought hot water to his shaving stand, as if he might walk in at any moment. Every evening, his nightclothes were laid out on the bed. Fresh flowers were placed in the vases. The pocket watch on the bedside table was wound. It was a performance of life in the face of death, a denial of absence through the sheer force of ritual. This cult of mourning spread across the world. It made grief visible. It gave people a script for their sorrow. The black crepe armbands, the jewelry made of jet, the lockets containing a strand of hair. It was heavy, yes. It was stifling. But it was also a way of saying that love matters, that the loss of a partner is a tectonic shift that cannot be rushed. Victoria often wrote in her journals of the loneliness of the widow's cap. She described the silence of the palace as a physical weight. Yet, in that silence, she forged a new kind of connection with her people. She became the matriarch of sorrow. When she finally died in 1901, concluding the Victorian era, she left instructions for her funeral. She did not want to be buried in black. She asked to be buried in white, wearing her wedding veil. In the end, she was not the queen in mourning. She was the bride, finally returning to the husband who had been waiting for her in the quiet of the Blue Room for 40 years. Title: The Revolution of the Night. From straw to spring's tone. Soothing, technical, historical. Let us step away from the specific lives of queens and presidents And look at the stage where all these dramas played out. The bed itself. We take our sleep environments for granted today. A flat mattress, soft sheets, a quiet room. But the history of the bed is a history of technology and class warfare. In the medieval period, the bed was the most expensive piece of furniture in the house. It was so valuable that it was often named in wills, passed down from generation to generation like a plot of land. But these beds were not the private sanctuaries we know. They were gay, sprawling structures, often sleeping an entire family, and sometimes their guests. Privacy was non-existent. Sleep was a communal activity, a pile of warm bodies against the cold. The mattress was usually a sack of straw. Every morning, you had to hit the hay, quite literally beating the mattress to shake out the bugs and redistribute the lumps. If you were wealthy, you might have feathers. But feathers had their own problems. They rotted, they smelled, and the quills would poke through the fabric. The revolution of comfort began in the 19th century with the invention of the coil spring. Suddenly, the bed was no longer a sack on the floor. It was a suspension system. It lifted the sleeper away from the drafts and the dust. It allowed for air circulation, and crucially, it stopped the bed from sagging in the middle, which meant that two people could sleep in the same bed without inevitably rolling into each other. This led to a fascinating social shift in the 1920s. The rise of the twin bed, influenced by the germ theory of disease. Health experts began to warn that sharing a bed was unhealthy. They argued that sleeping alone allowed the body to recharge better, free from the battery effect of another person's warmth and movement. For a few decades, the height of modern, sophisticated marriage was a bedroom with two separate beds, divided by a nightstand. It was a sterile, clinical view of intimacy. The bedroom became a laboratory for health, rather than a nest for connection. But the twin bed era did not last. The pool of comfort, and perhaps the human need for the sound of another's breathing, brought the double bed back into fashion by the 1950s. The king-size bed was introduced, a vast continent of mattress that promised the best of both worlds. The closeness of the double bed with the space of the twin. So tonight, as you adjust your pillow and pull up the duvet, consider the centuries of engineering and social change that engineered this moment. You are not just sleeping on a mattress. You are sleeping on a monument to the human desire for comfort, privacy, and peace. The straw has gone. The communal crowds have dispersed. The springs are silent, and the night is yours.